Welcome to our session that we are calling Collaborating to Collect in a New Normal Collections Ecosystem. This session was also advertised as Print versus E-Collections and Collaborative Collection Development. So if that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. My name is Judy Alspaugh, and I'm from the Center for Research Libraries. I would first like to thank Lilith Harpenza from the University of California, Berkeley, and Patricia Figueroa from Brown University, who worked with me on putting together this panel. We're so pleased to have brought together 4 luminaries who will speak to us today about our themes on collaborative collections work and the current challenges in meeting the needs of researchers through print and/or electronic content during a time of diminished resources and changing policies. We hope to interrogate how the collections built by forward-thinking librarians in the past have borne fruit in these dynamic times, and how we might deepen our work together as we aim to provide access to collections for the scholars of today and tomorrow. So a few housekeeping details for you. Your microphones have been muted in order to decrease unintended background noise. This session is being recorded, and we intend to make it available later. We'll hear all 4 presentations and then have time for questions and discussions at the end. As questions occur to you throughout the presentations, please type them into the Q&A function, not the chat. And then my colleague Lilith Har will moderate the Q&A session after all of the panelists have finished. So our first luminary today is that will speak to us is Mike Furlow, who became the executive director of HathiTrust in 2014. During his time leading the organization, HathiTrust has grown to include over 170 members, serving over 270 universities and college campuses. Prior to joining HathiTrust, Mike served as Associate Dean for Research and Scholarly Communications at Penn State University. He began his library career providing research and instructional support for geospatial and statistical data at the University of Virginia. And he lives and works in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So Mike, please take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to share my screen, and once I do, I know from experience that I won't be able to see anyone very well. So if you need my attention, shout at me. Okay. Thanks. I hope everyone's well today. I hope that those of you in the United States had a good Thanksgiving holiday and that your family and your friends and your colleagues all remain safe at this time. This morning, I've been asked to talk about collective stewardship in this context. I want to say up front that I'm going to be speaking more generically and less about particular subject areas, and certainly not in detail about area studies. I'll talk about what HathiTrust has been doing to provide access during the pandemic. And I assume many of you are HathiTrust members and are familiar with some of these services, but I'm not going to assume that too much, and I'll be trying to provide as much background as possible. So let me start by reminding you that HathiTrust had its origins in the early part of the 20th century when major organizations like Google and Internet Archive and Microsoft began to work on mass digitization programs. These organizations partnered with libraries and sought to digitize hundreds of thousands or millions or even entire collections from research libraries around the world. And at that time, when Google started these conversations, they were really thinking more about how to add data to a search engine, to improve results, to draw eyeballs, and to increase ad revenues. But I have always argued that the libraries that were partnering with Google actually were more ambitious for the program and for the partnership than Google itself was. They understood that this would enable fundamental transformations in how they collected and managed and provided access to these collective collections, building on centuries, if not and decades of work that they had put into it. They understood that we had opportunities in library land to do things with these collections that Google didn't. Some of these were exceptions provided under copyright law. In other cases, we simply knew that our mission was based on preservation and stewardship of cultural heritage and that these were very clearly not Google's mission, and that we would need to take responsibility for serving our users more directly if we were going to do this work. So our founding members of HathiTrust, the University of California and the institutions of the Big Ten, were all partners with Google or Internet Archive both. And when we came out, when we started in 2008, we began taking a long view and have always done so. We believe our mission is to provide access now, but work to provide large-scale solutions for large-scale challenges. I'll talk about a couple of those in a second. Our foundation is really in collaborative and collective stewardship of the scholarly record that's found in academic libraries. And we very, very much believe in ourselves as a member-driven organization that's based on collective investment and collaborative work. We do think of ourselves, or try to think of ourselves, as a extension of each of our member libraries, which helps you further, or helps your colleagues further drive access services and preservation mission at your institution. The idea is that our members are contributing to its development, not just in adding collections or in digitizing materials, but also through staff who are doing some of the work of the programs or participating in programs as we go. I like to think that there's a real power in organizing ourselves as part of a library and being of and by for libraries and being supported by these libraries, and in stewarding a collection of this size, because we end up, I believe, with not just the ability, but the responsibility to tackle significant and longer standing challenges in our field and do it for the good of the whole. So if you look at our portfolio, we've got a number of different things that are not as easily done at the local level. For example, our accessible text request service allows users who are blind or print disabled to gain access to any of the 17 million copies of books in HathiTrust. Our copyright review program, which is staffed by individuals at 30 or 40 libraries at a time, has been reviewing and investigating the copyright status of works for about 10 years. They've looked at over 900,000 and have determined that more than 500,000 of these were in the public domain and could be open worldwide, or at least in the United States. And we have other programs to support text and data mining and shared print, which is our attempt to link digital preservation and print preservation to ensure the longevity of the print record going forward. These are all opportunities, but really, again, I want to emphasize this as a responsibility that we have, right? If we're able to aggregate in this way, we need to work in a large scale and we need to tackle large scale challenges. And there are some times when opportunity does arise and you realize you're at a moment where you have to do something different. And that certainly was the case earlier this spring when we all began to understand the enormity of the pandemic that was beginning to face us. This pandemic reinforced something that I think each of us knew intuitively, which was that our individual health and our collective fates are all deeply connected with the behavior and activity of others. And this is something that we as librarians, I think, understood as well. We've always attempted to build more interdependence and resilience in our system, and that's given us more power to serve our users going into the future. And I think that this is in part what Roger Schoenfeld at Ithaca meant earlier this year when he wrote that library digitization had found its moment. He was noting there that through significant vision and foresight and a long history of digitization, libraries had actually prepared for a moment like this, that we'd arrived at something like a just-in-case moment for all of us. And so this service that we launched, which we call ETAS, or Emergency Temporary Access Service, has honestly been the single most important thing we've ever done, because what it has done is provided thousands of individuals with access to library collections when we all had to do an unthinkable thing and shut our doors. And our libraries began to reopen their doors and limit entry for the safety of staff and their users, and it's continued to serve those users at that as that has happened as well. As we started this, we really thought our goal needed to be to help libraries carry out their mission, the mission that they were there to do, but were inhibited from doing in this context. And so to do this, we needed to think carefully about the legal and policy underpinnings. We have always strictly observed copyright and have left much of the collection unavailable for access because much of it is in copyright. So we had to conduct our policy analysis and copyright review ourselves. And we determined that under fair use, we felt like we could make access available if we limited the mode of access, the universe of users, and reduce the potential for additional circulation of copyrighted works. In particular, we looked at the first and the fourth factors of copyright, of fair use, where the first factor indicates the nature of the use, and we determined that we would make it available primarily for educational purposes. So students, faculty, and staff would have access to this service, but generally not members of the public. The fourth factor, which is the impact on the market of the fair use, is a little bit tricky because you could argue that if we make a book available online, someone doesn't have to buy it. That is assuming they could find a copy. But in our estimation, we could limit this impact by focusing strictly on places where libraries were shut or in a tough spot, if you will, that we limited the number of books or the types of books that could be made available and so forth. So based on all of that analysis, you see here on this screen the key elements of our program. And one thing that's really important is we felt we had to assess everybody's situation. We had to take the effort to hear from people and understand what they were doing, why they were responding to the pandemic in the way they were, and then look to see, are their collections, is the access to their collections disrupted from the way it normally would because of this emergency? And if so, then we would be assuming that those books were unavailable for circulation in general, generally unavailable. And then we could provide authenticated access to the students, faculty, and staff of that institution, at least for those books that were owned by the library and that could be found in HathiTrust. And we determined that for every book that your library held, one user at your university or college could have access to that item at a time, I should say, one simultaneous user per physical copy. We developed this for the pandemic, but we could put it in place in the future in other situations, like a mold outbreak or a fire or a flood or something other really terrible. One of the reasons we could do this quickly is that we had been collecting data from our libraries for a long time about what was held in collections. We already knew essentially what was on the shelves, and you're seeing here, whoops, skip back, here we go, skip back. This screen right here is showing you just counts of items in various member libraries and the number of items that match HathiTrust. And this is an analysis and a report that we run every month, and we've done so for years. It's underpinned certain services, underpinned our shared print program, and other activities. So this was really key. This long-term stewardship of this metadata asset was really important to us. But maybe more important to us is not just the technical underpinnings behind this, but actually what we saw people doing with the collection, what we were hearing from users. We were seeing how people were finishing their books, finishing their dissertations when they really could not even leave the house. We see on social media continuously folks helping other users find this service. And we see some often generously stated and sometimes less generously stated suggestions for improvement on the service as well. Since we launched the service in April, we had up to 190 different institutions using the service. We're now down to about 125 or so, but it is still a really important part of what we're doing and has come to be almost the thing that we do all this year. We haven't had time to really dive into the data and understand what users are looking for in terms of subject or very much in detail. We have looked at date, and one of the things that I was curious about was trying to understand, how does data publication influence use, or rather, can we see any patterns related to data publication? And this chart's pretty busy. I call it the Virginia chart because it's kind of shaped like the state of Virginia. But the key point here is this, that for the books that are available through this service, 2/3 of them were published before 1988. Yet those 2/3 account for less than half of the usage of the materials from this emergency service. But materials published after 1988 account for more than half of that. And in fact, materials published in the 21st century are really the heaviest used items in the collection. That suggests that the historical legacy collection remains a valuable resource, but it's clear that people are looking for current or more recent materials, as you would expect. It is possible that a good many of these more recent and certainly older materials are not available in licensed ebook packages and may not be available online anywhere else. That is something that would be an interesting project to pursue, and then to understand more about subject areas related to date. But that's not something we've had a chance to go into yet. It's another research project I hope we can find time for in the beginning of the year. Like a lot of you, I sit around during the last week and thought, how long can this go on? What's going to happen next, and how will we need to respond to that? And things are looking better in many ways, at least if you follow medical news and news of vaccines. But in the medium term, I do expect that our libraries, many of yours too, will be disrupted in many ways through most of 2021. I hope that there are fewer libraries in need of this service by next fall. But our top priority for the coming year is going to be to continue to provide this service and support our libraries in other ways in the pandemic. Our assumption is that as long as libraries are in need, they are suffering some kind of disruption that prevents users from accessing collections like they normally would, then we should be providing this service and supporting the educational mission of those institutions. We've been responding already over the last couple of weeks to a few universities and colleges that have changed their plans for the winter term, or rather the post-Thanksgiving period, and even the upcoming winter term, and seek to reactivate this service. There is something else that I think is important to keep in mind about the future too, and that is that things are not going to go back the way they were, right? There's a lot of folks I know who are really resistant to teaching online. They've now seen the affordances of teaching online. They understand how they can do it. And that's not true in every discipline. It's very discipline specific, what works well online and what does not. But I will hazard a guess that we'll see online learning make or be more important going forward, even where there are strong residential programs. I think that means that puts more pressure on libraries to provide digital access to materials, to licensing materials, possibly at the expense of buying materials for the physical collection. That's really accelerating a trend that is underway. And it's because of that, I think it's not surprising that we're frequently asked if something like this emergency access service will continue after the pandemic, whatever after means. And my honest response to everyone is always that we're really focused on the now, on this moment, and trying to make sure we can do what we can in this moment. We want to use the current year to improve the service as far as we can. But there's been a lot of discussion in the library community over the last 6 or 7 months about libraries continuing to adopt something known as controlled digital lending, which is, I think of it as a generic term for providing access to copyrighted materials, digital access to copyrighted materials when you own books. It's as closely associated with Internet Archive, which has put forward a particular legal argument about why such access in non-emergencies would be accessible, or rather acceptable. And while we've been evaluating how we can provide access to copyrighted works for a long time, we've never felt that we could do something like this outside of an emergency. We've never felt that there was a lawful path for us to do it. We just didn't see how we could justify it outside of the pandemic context. Now, that's not to say it can't be done. It's just to say that based on our structure, our collection structure, our stewardship structure, we didn't see a way we could do it lawfully. What I would like to remind us too is that the Copyright Act gives us guidelines and not hard rules. And in fact, there is a lawsuit out now against the Internet Archive filed by 4 of the largest commercial publishers that seeks to undermine library reliance on fair use to provide digital access to copyrighted works. And it specifically seeks to demolish the legal arguments made in support of controlled digital lending. It's going to be years before that is resolved. It's an unfortunate suit. It should not have been filed. There shouldn't have been a reason for publishers to file it. We should want Internet Archive to prevail on that suit. And anytime a court is asked to weigh in on fair use and how libraries can apply it, we should be concerned and be nervous about it. When we move outside of the strict confines of the United States copyright law, then we don't even have fair use available, and it becomes even more complicated to contemplate how we do this. So that's what I have to say about the future of something like ETAS after the fact. It's not to rule it out, it's just to say that right now we cannot see past the next several months. And there's a lot of other things I think that are germane to this topic I would like to spend time talking with you about this morning. If we had even an hour, I would only scratch the surface on some of these. For example, the characteristics of the collection are really worth considering in HathiTrust. This chart shows you that more than 2/3 of the collection comes from really just about 5 major research libraries in the US. And we know that that is only a slice of what can be found on those shelves. We know that what those libraries have is only a slice of what can be found in WorldCat. We don't know really well what's missing. We don't know for sure what is underrepresented and what is overrepresented, and we need to define those terms. One worry I have too going forward is that the effect of the pandemic may be to curtail how libraries can make collected investments for the good of the whole. And I think we're going to have to face some really important questions going forward, such as for those who can no longer make those investments, to what extent, to what degree can they continue to take advantage of the results of those collective investments made by others? That's an important question. I look forward to having some opportunity to talk about it with you today. I'm deeply appreciative this morning of having the opportunity to talk to you and be part of this program. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of it. So thank you so much for this. And I will now stop and turn it over to someone else for the next presentation.
Thanks so much, Mike. And I'd like to remind the participants to please enter your questions in the Q&A function, as Mike's very thought-provoking presentation probably led to a lot of questions, so please type them in there. Our next speaker will be Jana Krenz. She is the librarian for Latin American and Iberian collections and Latinx studies at Yale University Library. Prior to coming to Yale, she held the position of head of the Department for Spain, Portugal, and Latin America at the University of Kansas Libraries and was the head of the International and Area Studies unit there. So welcome to Jana, and take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you this morning from stormy New Haven. I'm going to be speaking to you about collaborative collection development, in particular, the Brazilian Borrow Direct program. The goal of this particular program is to create a shared Brazilian collection, kind of a mega collection in the Northeast of the United States. And we're doing this by purchasing materials in a more comprehensive way from outside the large publishing centers of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, focusing on regional publishers. So Latin American librarianship has had a long history of really successful collaborative collection development programs. Most of them have been under the auspices of SALAM, the Seminar on the Acquisitions of Latin American Library Materials. This is our Latin American Librarians Association. The one I want to focus on here is LARP, the Latin American Research Resources Project. This started back in 1995 and has, I think, 64 members right now. There's a lot of facets of this particular project, but there's a distributed resources project that I'd like to just mention briefly. It was created to strengthen collective coverage of Latin American monographs. And we do this by reallocating 7% of our materials budget. The members choose either a country, a region, or a subject, something that builds on local holdings and local collection strengths. It's been very, very successful. So when we started to talk about doing a program, a collaborative collection development program for Brazil, we never really thought that we would fail. We were building on the successes of all of these projects. So we got together at our LANE meeting. LANE is one of our consortiums under the SALAM umbrella, the Latin American Northeastern Librarians Consortium. And we talked about the need to cover this, have a deeper coverage of Brazil for our constituents. When we took a step back, we realized that the institutions that had the strongest Brazilian components in the curriculum and those that had the strongest Brazilian library collections were all within the Borrow Direct system under the Ivies Plus Library Group. Borrow Direct is an interlibrary loan network of 13 institutions. Most of them are Ivies in the Northeast, but also Duke, Stanford, and University of Chicago. So we thought we would base our collaboration on this Borrow Direct connection. We have 11 participants. Brown, Chicago, Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth, Duke, Harvard, Penn, Princeton, and Yale, who are all part of this Brazilian project. So in preparing, we obviously needed to meet to talk about this, and to prepare for the meeting, we gathered statistics and data from our Brazilian book vendors, book publishing output by region, average cost of books, estimates on funds needed to purchase a publishing output by state. We also compiled detailed spreadsheets summarizing monographic holdings amongst the board direct libraries using data from 2008 and 2012. And we used WorldCat to compile that data. So we met at Columbia and we discussed, first of all, how we were going to divide Brazil up. We decided to divide it by state. We talked about the duplication of monographs from the large Brazilian publishing centers of Sao Paulo and Rio. We talked about cataloging and how we would get these cataloged, the role of our book vendors in acquiring these books, budget constraints, project evaluation and assessment. And we spent a lot of time talking about what the collection scope was and what we would include and what we would not include. We also started to draft a memorandum of understanding, which was later okayed by our collection development officers and library directors. So why did we pick Brazil? Well, there was a growing interest, or there is a growing interest in Brazil nationwide. And there was a need in academia for Brazilian materials from all regions, not just Sao Paulo and Rio. Brazil is a huge country. It's bigger than the continental United States. So you can imagine how many books are being published. And there was an increased publishing output in Brazil. Brazilian books have gotten very expensive. There's high shipping fees. And most of our budgets are flat right now. So most Latin American collections buy core materials from Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, even though most of the research is focused on other regional areas. Our Brazilian vendors process approximately 3,600 titles a year, about $133,000. But estimates show that a comprehensive collecting focus would be something around 5,000 titles or $150,000 a year. Harvard has the most comprehensive Brazilian collection amongst us, and they only acquire about 2,500 titles a year. So you can see that a lot of titles are not being purchased. Meanwhile, our faculty and our staff and our students were telling us that they were purchasing their own materials from other regions because they couldn't find them in libraries. And we also had a concern that the Library of Congress may stop collecting Brazilian materials in the future. So we wanted to ensure that we had at least one copy of a book in the US. So at our meeting, we each member identified a specific region or state that complemented their local collection and existing research strengths. So this is the LARP model that we used. So it's grounded in individual budget capacities. Some of us took 2 states, 3 states. Some of us took whole regions of Brazil. So we're getting better coverage outside of Rio and Sao Paulo. We increased the coverage of small presses and publishers, but we continue to collect core materials from Rio and Sao Paulo, again, according to our local needs. We agreed to collect newly published titles, replace lost or stolen titles, to attempt to acquire retrospective materials if available. And we agreed to a long-term commitment to collect and maintain these books through preservation, through personnel such as selectors with subject expertise, and ordering and cataloging support. With the scope of the collaboration, what we spent, as I said, a lot of time trying to figure out what to include and what to exclude. We decided to exclude materials from law, medicine, and some areas of fine arts because most of the participating libraries have separate libraries and selectors for these disciplines. We excluded materials that don't circulate, like ephemera and literatura de cordel, textbooks, devotional texts, and sheet music. But we included a wide range of subjects, as you can see. Our memorandum of understanding covers print format, but we still may collect non-print materials. I know a lot of us are collecting, some of us are collecting ephemera, some of us are collecting films, physical media, web-based and born digital when possible and when reasonable. We also set a limit of $100 per item. And this dollar limit guarantees a focus on current non-special collections material. So I want to mention something about our book vendors. We have 3 main book vendors, and these are kind of small mom and pop businesses in country who can really ferret out materials for us. We have a very close, almost familial relationship with our vendors. So our agreement doesn't favor one of these vendors over another. They were very concerned that a collaborative collection development program might cause a reduction in orders. However, the opposite has been true. It's really increased the number of books because we continue purchasing those core materials from Sao Paulo and Rio, while in addition, we're purchasing those materials from regional areas. So some of the benefits have been to reduce lacuna and to create, and this is a quote from the Memorandum of Understanding, a shared collection of great diversity, depth, and comprehensiveness that could not be created singly by any of the member institutions. We agreed to reasonable efforts to ensure timely acquisitions, access, and cataloging, to retain the works indefinitely, long-term preservation, and the materials must be available to Borrow Direct patrons on a priority basis through interlibrary loan. At the time that we were talking about this agreement and it was taking shape, the Ivies Plus Library Group had created a position of Director of Collections Initiatives, and they were actually in the middle of the search. This position has now been filled, and we work with this person very closely. They have some responsibility for, or they almost have all the responsibility for the assessment of the program. And with assessment, we tried to figure out what data was necessary and how it should be gathered. We talked a little bit about using the search strings we had used in the initial WorldCat analysis, but a lot of this data would have been dirty. The University of Pennsylvania cataloging team suggested a note in the MARC record that item must be retained. And we thought this was a great idea. So we took this to the Director of Collections Initiatives. The technical, this is actually, assessment has been a potential hurdle for us. The technical services group of the Ivies Plus discussed and approved a retention note, and the wording of the note in April of 2019. It took them a long time. We agreed to this in 2014. And participating libraries have been very slow to implement the note, and they've been slow in implementing priority cataloging. And we feel we can't really proceed with assessment unless this note is present. It's the best way we have of pulling data from participating libraries and gauging the usage of titles. Right now, we have a lot of libraries just kind of doing their own thing. Some of the other potential hurdles are cataloging. Most of the titles are going to need original cataloging, which of course is time consuming and expensive. They need priority cataloging, and we know there's a shortage of catalogers, and that's not going to get any better. We have budget restrictions. We've already reallocated meager budgets, but all of us, understand that collaborative collection development is our best solution to stretch our collection dollars and provide comprehensive research materials. And we've seen this from all of those successful collaborative collection development projects that I showed you at the beginning. During COVID, well, just actually 2 weeks ago, a survey was created to gauge the progress of this retention note creation. And we want to use this data to take to our tech services departments to kind of spur them on to get the retention note and start using the wording that's been okayed. Library closures with COVID has meant that approval shipments cannot be opened and processed, but that hasn't been that much of a problem since our book vendors in Brazil did not close down because of COVID due to the mandates from the Bolsonaro government. So they just kind of stockpiled books for future shipments. And then, we're all experiencing budget reductions right now. The impact of those budget reductions on this program really right now are unknown. We probably will have a better sense of that next spring or next summer. But right now, it's been working very well. It's been easy to implement, and we look forward to working on it in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Jana. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everybody that at 3:45 p.m. that's Central Time today, you'll have to do your own calculation. We're going to be having a wrap-up discussion of all of the panels so we can explore some of these themes in greater detail. So hopefully you can join us for that. You may already have the link. If not, please be in touch with me or Patricia or Lilithar, and we can help you out and get you registered. So our next speaker is Mary Rader, who is the South Asia Studies Librarian and head of the Arts, Humanities, and Global Studies Engagement Team at the University of Texas at Austin, having held positions previously at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the University of Michigan, and the Chicago Public Library. Thanks for joining us, Mary.
I think this will sound familiar based on the presentation we just had, but I think that is telling of where we're at as a community. So I wanted to thank the Coalition of Librarians for Equity and Access, particularly Judy, Patricia, and Lilithar, for the invitation to participate in today's collection forum. Like the wonderfully provocative Area Studies manifestos, that prompted the formation of the coalition, these grassroots statements, particularly in the aggregated collection of them, not only challenge us to be more mindful and aware of our work practices, the topics we're addressing at today's forum, but they also reinvigorate us as area studies librarians and compel us to work together, what we're actually practicing through today's forum. I applaud the coalition, the area studies committees, and the many other recent online gatherings regarding area and international studies librarianship for operationalizing our grassroots alliances into action. My role in today's panel is to describe another grassroots initiative for collective action, namely the South Asia Cooperative Collection Development Workshops, and I may start calling it SACOOP, so just buckle up for that. And to use the SACOOP example as a lens to problematize decision-making that erases structural inequities and prioritizes one format over another. The danger of these decisions and priorities is that they do not advance what I believe is our long ago agreed upon and established shared vision for deep, rich, and robust collections, what we currently are trending to signal under the rubric of diversity and inclusion, but I would argue this is long ago agreed upon. Until our vision is fully realized, we will continue to have these discussions and presentations, and that, I think we can all agree, is productive. The South Asia Cooperative Collection Development Workshops began with a bet. My co-conspirator, Bronwyn Bledsoe of Cornell University, and I had begun discussing how we could share collections and expertise across institutions rather than competing with each other. At one of our annual consult meetings, Bronwyn and my mentor told us that any kind of formal collaboration was impossible, and that if we could pull it off in any form, he'd treat us to dinner at the next annual meeting. While we did not embrace competition across our library collections, he did spur us into action because I guess competition is a motivator after all. And in 2009, we had a small signed agreement between Cornell and Wisconsin, and Bronwyn and I had an elaborate free dinner. A year later, James Simon of CRL joined Bronwyn and I as we invited like-minded and energetic librarian colleagues from across Consult to join us in thinking together about our collection practices. 11 years later, and with the added leadership of Judy Alsbaugh and Karen Stoll-Farrell, that bet has paid off more than a single meal. Despite the hubbub around SACOOP, collaboration for South Asia collections in the United States is not actually new. While many libraries and research centers across the country had small pockets of South Asia-related material before the 1950s, the majority of big South Asia collections in the United States came to their current expansive state under the PL 480 and subsequent Library of Congress Cooperative Acquisitions Program schemes. We have all benefited greatly by these schemes, not only because of the tremendous amount of and variety of material acquired, but also because of the technical support associated with them, including procurement, shipping, and cataloging records. Centralized field offices in Delhi and Islamabad oversee the selection of materials in all languages and subjects of South Asia, using profiled matrices based on country, language, and subject, not on publisher or cost point things that we get real anxious about in the Global North. For example, shown here are some of the profiles for non-English materials. The field offices procure multiple, and I would add duplicative, triplicative, quadruplicative, go on, copies of materials for participant libraries. They create cataloging records for virtually all of the materials. First this was in cards, and now it's obviously in OCLC. And this is a tremendous and not to be dismissed help for all of us. I'll talk about more of this in a minute. Positions such as mine were first created to manage the sea of materials coming in through the PL 480 and the LCCAP programs. And a generation of US trained academics cut their teeth on and have come to expect the ready, quote unquote, comprehensiveness of South Asian material at our institutions. The PL 480 and LC programs were certainly robust and expansive, but they were not highly nuanced to individual institutional needs. The models promised staffing and financial efficiencies and created opportunities for new modes of teaching and learning, yet they did not allow for pre-selection at the title level. They were particularly presentist in their orientations, and finally, through master strokes of centralization, they have led us to believe that we don't need specialized staff. Their promises of simplicity and comprehensiveness have seductively erased our commitments to resources and to research that falls outside their scopes. We in research libraries, especially those of us in area studies, need to be vigilant and to constantly re-articulate and re-educate folks about how and when we can rely on these tools and when these tools aren't helping us achieve our greater mission. That greater mission, the vision I invoked a few minutes ago, is to develop diverse collections that not only support a wide range of research, but also provoke it. The confluence of restrained budgets and restricted purchasing options make it difficult for libraries to support our local communities in the ways they have become accustomed, and make it difficult to both distinguish ourselves from each other and to support each other, despite spending thousands of dollars and a tremendous amount of staff effort. What the SACOOP effort allows, or at least provokes, is to put our efforts into creating spaces and processes, albeit small ones, for us to distinguish ourselves within the larger community of information resource provision, thereby developing locally distinctive collections that support the national collection. Put another way, we can and should shift, particularly with the motivation of DEI initiatives, from quote, how many to quote, how different. International collections are one piece in that broad shift. While many items in area studies collections across the country might be relatively pedestrian or commonplace in their countries of origin, things like literary works, government documents, scholarly monographs, and so on, When these items come together in one place outside of their country of origin, they take on a new and oftentimes powerful significance, a contextual significance, if you will, that is often unparalleled elsewhere around the world. PL 480 and the LC programs help us in this, but as I've kind of described, also hinders us. We need to employ, but also to look beyond the readily accessible options. I'm biased, but I believe our context implores us to collaborate. Over the past 11 years, SACOOP has been a vehicle to explore the mechanisms for cooperative collection development. In the early days, this felt like charging at windmills, as very few of our national colleagues were either interested or logistically able to partner in this way. I'm going to refer you back to that PL 480 history I just gave you. I apologize to those on this webinar who've heard all this before. I tell this story over and over again. But I believe it's only through repetition and through unwavering commitment to the idea that we have been able to make some progress. The trick, it seems, would be to address head-on all concerns and hesitations of those ready to collaborate and to seek solutions that exploit the tools and strategies we already have. For us in SACOOP, that means working within established infrastructure, from the professional grouping of Consult, including its annual meeting, and the Library of Congress programs, but also pushing ourselves to build new infrastructures. Over the years, we have manipulated our PL 480 or LCCAP profiles to minimize duplication. We have questioned the balance between highly and lowly subscribed serial subscriptions across our institutions, and we have encouraged internal and external outreach and communication. I would argue that our most productive and deeply impactful work has been in our ongoing local declarations of strength in support of the national collection. We call these our niche specializations, as ways of working together. Many of us, myself included, have used the SACOOP niche opportunity to retrain and re-educate ourselves in the multiple fields of South Asian studies, a process that reveals the necessity of foreign travel, and we're going to have a panel on this afternoon, I hope everybody attends, and that close liaison work with researchers is essential. Because these niches align well with our current appeals to diversity and inclusion, I'm going to take a moment to highlight the niche work of two of our newer members of SACOOP. Ellen Ambersoni is adding to, curating, and digitizing a collection of multilingual, multinational, and multidisciplinary ephemera from South Asia at Princeton, materials that are difficult to acquire, difficult to house, and difficult to describe. Jeff Pierce is developing a collection on the Indo-Caribbean at Penn, a collection that complicates dominant narratives of South Asian migration history, and which includes materials related to the arts, to politics, to gender, to race, and beyond. If you're interested in learning more about our niches, I encourage you to visit our website. I only have a limited time now. But beyond our niches and approval plan adjustments, our grassroots collaboration highlights structural fissures that impede us. The past few years, we've tried to think about whether our collaborative is mature enough to receive structural recognition and support. In my last few minutes, I encourage us to use the example of SACOOP to highlight our structural challenges. From 2016 to 2018, 3 years, 3 long years, SACOOP librarians used the annual workshops to focus attention on print retention agreements. If we are buying materials not only for ourselves, but also for others, and I point you to the excellent work of Mara Thacker and her colleagues at Illinois on area studies in interlibrary loan, documentation seems imperative to uphold our intentions, both to ensure the retention of any individual item or collection, but also, and this is important, to acknowledge the deeply interconnected nature of our collections. Despite extensive effort, only 3 of our members were able to obtain signed retention agreements. As the tireless efforts of Marie Waltz and Amy Wood on the paper registry and print archiving network show, this is not a challenge unique to SACOOP, but one that our professional communities have to address, hopefully sooner rather than too late. And I just wanted to share of note, we have another grassroots manifesto on this problem. This fall, SACOOP used our annual workshop to focus on cataloging and description as a challenge to distinctive collection building. As I described earlier, our reliance on the Library of Congress program was not just for procurement, but also for description. Our effort this fall was to document the dwindling support for technical processing at our individual institutions as a giant hurdle to diversifying our holdings and our impact. As the COVID-19 area studies statements attest, our collective workflows have to be broad enough to include acquisitions workflows that are not dominated by particular formats or distribution networks. They also have to allow that, unlike the majority of electronic products on the market, not all acquisitions include metadata in their procurement, let alone complicated multilingual, multi-script description that is needed by area studies collections. The effects of this fall's SACOOP workshop are still in progress, but I remain hopeful that, if nothing else, we will raise awareness and begin discussions on how to share expertise. And I think this is something Jeff will probably talk about in a second. These two hurdles may seem esoteric or SACOOP specific, but I believe they beg the question of the impact of many of our grassroots movements. How will less formalized sharing mechanisms, SACOOP obviously, but also challenges of LARP's distributed resources, collections divvied up through the Too Cool program, and so on. How will this sharing be recognized when automated tools determine user access to content? For example, we all benefited greatly from the emergency access to HOTI over the past few months. Thanks, Mike, for his presentation a couple minutes ago. But who among us was able to access digitized print holdings that were designated as unique but shared during this time? I'm not suggesting that there's a problem with HathiTrust. I really am not. I'm using it as an example. Rather that the automated mechanisms that might be based on ownership fail us when we come to shared access. This is for our print materials that generally sit still on the shelf, and I would argue not for lack of interest, but because they're waiting for their moment. If we're encouraged to only acquire electronic materials, as many of us were explicitly required to do so here in the pandemic, this surely impacts any kind of cooperative sharing down the road. Our appeals to openness and collaboration will fall short. As we want to achieve our agreed upon and established vision of deeper, richer, and more diverse and more inclusive collective collection, we need recognition that knowledge is created, shared, preserved, and accessed in many different ways. As 11 years of our workshops, the recent area study statements, and today's forum demonstrates, librarians from around the country are eager to cooperate and do the necessary work to broaden and deepen access to resources for our constituencies. Our grassroots movements and manifestos have captured the attention and the imagination of our local administrators as they speak to what our libraries currently strive to do, namely to collaborate with each other. They also speak to our core purpose, namely to offer a breadth of resources to our clienteles. And finally, they speak to our aspirations, namely to the increasing call to diversity in our collections. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary, for that very interesting and provocative presentation. Our final speaker today is Jeff Shane, who is the Southeast Asia Reference Librarian and Thai Specialist at Ohio University in beautiful Athens, Ohio. Since 2010, Jeff has served as the chair of the Committee on Research Materials on Southeast Asia, also known as CORMOSIA. Jeff.
Thank you, Judy, for the introduction, and thank you all for inviting me to participate on this panel. As is often the case, the digital initiative that I will be speaking about today was inspired by a series of setbacks, years of floundering, and the customary hand-wringing one endures when trying to figure out what went wrong. I am referring to our first collective attempt at building a Southeast Asia digital library. The problem then, as now, is how to meet the challenge of sustainability. Before delving into this question, a little background is perhaps in order. Since 2010, I have chaired the Committee on Research Materials on Southeast Asia, or CORMOSIA, which is akin to SALAM, CONSOLD, SEAL, and other such organizations, albeit considerably smaller, which is not surprising since Southeast Asia is the smallest of the Title VI funded national resource centers. Cormacia was founded in 1969 under the auspices of the Association for Asian Studies. It was established to enhance and coordinate national efforts to collect and disseminate research materials on Southeast Asia. For more than 50 years, Cormacia member institutions and librarians have led the way in building world-class print collections on Southeast Asia. Over the course of the past 5 decades, our libraries have collectively acquired several million titles in over 100 languages. These collections directly support the curriculum and research of faculty and students throughout North America and, in fact, well beyond. Cormacia's first foray into the world of digital librarianship came in the early 2000s. With funding from the United States Department of Education, the Southeast Asia Digital Library, or CIDL, was established at Northern Illinois in 2005. Between 2005 and 2009, CIDL undertook 8 large-scale digitization projects with a special focus on unique Southeast Asian archival and historical materials in need of preservation. Subsequently, in 2009, CIDL was awarded a second grant culminating in the development of 9 additional initiatives. Now, the creation of CIDL was a significant accomplishment. It provided Cormacia with a prominent and readily discoverable digital platform to highlight, preserve, and enhance public access to some of the most unique collections on Southeast Asia. Now, this initial success notwithstanding, CIDL, like so many other digital initiatives launched around the turn of the millennium, ultimately proved difficult to sustain. The reasons for this are not hard to surmise. To begin with, CIDL was subsidized almost entirely by short-term grant funding invested mainly in the production of digital content, as opposed to infrastructure and human resources. Thus, once the final round of grant funding was exhausted, the creation of new digital content ground to a halt. From this, the only conclusion Cormacia was able to draw is that the creation of an alternative cost-sharing funding model coupled by a reinvestment in reinvestment in infrastructure and human resources was essential to the revitalization, if not the actual survival of CIDL. I wish I could say that this concept was received with rapture and vigorous applause. It was not. In fact, many Cormacia members were understandably skeptical about the notion of cost sharing. In the end, however, pragmatism seems to have carried the day. What occurred to us was that this proposed cost sharing model was essentially no different than the model employed by the Library of Congress Cooperative Acquisition Program, or for that matter, HathiTrust, or even CRL. It also occurred to us that very few, if any, of our institutions have the resources, financial or human, to build and sustain the growth of a digital library on our own. Even Cornell University, which can hardly plead poverty, faces serious obstacles due to overwhelming demand for digital content, competing interests, and shifting institutional priorities. Now, it is worth noting that these conversations about cost sharing did not take place in a vacuum. Overlapping with these discussions within Cormacia, something rather fortuitous was happening elsewhere. In the fall of 2018, the Henry Luce Foundation announced a new multi-year grants competition with a special focus on Southeast Asia. Since its founding in 1936, the Luce Foundation has awarded more than $1 billion in grant funding to support Asian studies. So in January 2019, we submitted a grant proposal to the Luce Foundation, and fortunately, Cormacia was awarded a 5-year, $1.2 million grant to put our plan into action. So what exactly does the grant entail? First, the Luce grant provided us with seed funding to establish 2 new permanent positions, a web developer at Northern Illinois and a digital librarian at Cornell University. These positions will materially enhance our ability to build and curate digital collections to meet the current and emerging research needs of faculty and students in Southeast Asia Studies. Second, additional grant funding was allocated to update the Southeast Asia Digital Library and launch a whole new generation of digital initiatives. To reiterate, the significance of this project lies mainly, mainly in its emphasis on collaboration and leveraging one-time grant funding to reinvest in human resources and infrastructure, coupled with the implementation of a cost-sharing funding model to ensure continued growth and sustainability of CITL beyond the cycle of the grant. How this cost-sharing funding model will function merits brief explanation. So the Luce Foundation agreed to fund the web developer position in full for a period of 4 years. In turn, NIU agreed to accept full responsibility for the position at the conclusion of the grant. According to our agreement, the web developer will be responsible for maintaining the CITL platform and discovery tools, in addition to general scripting, programming, updating, and systems administration. Next, the Luce Foundation agreed to fund the digital librarian position at Cornell in full for 4 years. Thereafter, the digital library position, modeled loosely after the the Ivy Plus program, was to evolve into a shared position whereby 50% of the total cost of the position will be absorbed by Cornell, and the remaining 50% will be divided equally among all participating Cormacia institutions. The shared digital librarian position will be expected to provide leadership, vision, and oversight of CITL and its digital collections, and take a very proactive approach to working with Cormacia members to collaborate on new digital projects. Although it perhaps goes without saying, to achieve the degree of sustainability to which we aspire, in which the Luce Foundation demands, it will require broad-based cooperation, a common vision, and above all else, financial commitment from all participating members within Cormacia to ensure the success of this initiative beyond the life of the grant. For the purpose of this grant proposal, I was asked to provide the Luce Foundation with written documentation to demonstrate broad-based, English is my first language, I promise you, to provide financial support. NIU agreed in writing to accept full responsibility for the cost of the web developer position at the conclusion of the grant cycle. Similarly, Cornell agreed to fund 50% of the cost of the digital library position at the end of the grant. Lastly, upon submitting our final proposal to the Luce Foundation, 8 Cormacia institutions had agreed in writing to share the remaining 50% of the cost of the digital librarian position at the end of the grant cycle. Since then, several additional universities have agreed in principle to join the consortia, which bodes very well for the future of the initiative and the prospects for even greater cooperation and collaboration down the road. Now, before concluding, it would be remiss of me not to address one final question that is undoubtedly on everyone's mind, namely the impact of COVID-19 on our project. To be sure, COVID-19 threw a rather unexpected wrench in the works. We are behind schedule on at least 2 digitization projects due to university lockdowns and the inability to access critical library resources and equipment. We have also had to improvise or rethink our approach to a few projects. Nevertheless, we are confident that we will be able to bring all of the proposed digital projects to fruition. Our optimism is due in no small measure to the fact that in spite of the pandemic, we were able to hire 2 very outstanding candidates for the positions of the web developer at NIU and the digital librarian at Cornell. We have very high hopes for both of these individuals. Equally important, COVID-19 and the ensuing financial crisis that has wreaked havoc on all of our universities has in many respects validated our logic, or excuse me, validated the logic, if not the necessity of our cooperative cost-sharing approach to building digital collections. In closing, I want to thank CRL for organizing this event. I would also like to acknowledge my Cormacia colleagues and friends. In spite of the fact that we are one of the smallest library organizations, it never ceases to amaze me what we have been able to accomplish. I owe my colleagues a huge debt of gratitude. Again, thanks for allowing me to talk. And if we would later on like to discuss some of the individual digital initiatives that we are working on, I would be very glad to talk about them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff, for your presentation. Thank you all panelists for giving their very thoughtful and thought-provoking insights in the world of librarianship and information studies. We do have 4 unanswered questions. I believe that 2 of them are to Mike. And the first question is from Judith Henche, and it says, what can we do to assist in the release of copyright for foreign titles that are probably orphan works? I know this is something Hathi has worked on, but is there a way of promoting this idea with the various area studies libraries groups, providing some guidelines for assessing titles that might be relatively easy targets for release? That's the first question. Mike, would you like to answer it, please?
Sure, I'll try to answer that as quickly as I can. So one thing to know is that we've stopped looking at orphan works per se, but we've continued to look at copyright status of works that are in the collection of HathiTrust. And we do have a review program that involves having 2 different individuals look at a particular work and investigate the copyright status of it. The way that has operated, we've focused on where we have the ability to get a lot of folks who have language knowledge. So we focused mostly in Western countries and primarily English language works, United States, United Kingdom, and Commonwealth nations. I would like to know if there are particular publication areas, or rather, let's put it another way, particular nations where works of substantial interest are sitting in HathiTrust, and we might be able to spin up a program for that. And I can then send that information over to the person who manages that program. We would want to know how many, we can investigate how many works would be able to be reviewed, but we'd also need to make sure we could secure enough time from enough people who have the language skills to actually be able to read relevant materials to do that copyright investigation work. So it's definitely possible. I can't promise a specific program, but we are looking for ideas into the future. So if you would like to send that information on, we can at least start to investigate. And I will type my email address in the chat window because I forgot to put it on the slide a little while ago.
Thank you, Mike. There's a next question from Jenny Ha, which says, is there HathiTrust ETEAS usage statistics by subject or languages?
So that's a good question. And we do not currently look at that, and we don't currently provide data by subject or language to the home institutions. We have been providing regular usage reports. I believe, but I'm not 100% positive, that what we report back includes the OCLC record numbers, so that it would be possible to link that back to catalog and do your catalog and do some of that analysis. But we've not done it at a macro level for the whole collection. We are evaluating what other services we can add to statistics support. So I can take that back and see if we can do that and add that in. How easily it could be done, I just don't know. So.
Thank you, Mike. I must compliment HathiTrust and you for your leadership in these difficult times. The ETES has been a lifesaver for me as the librarian for 2 or 3 different complex areas of the world. So thank you. The next question is to my mentor from Salam, Jana Krenz, from Other Salamista, Isabel Espinal. Are there efforts to work with Brazilian publishers and vendors and other countries in these collaborative arrangements to make digital copies of these materials available? And are any of these efforts open access? That's the first question. And then it follows up with second question, which says, do you see a connection between the lack of expertise in libraries in these languages and cultures and the prevalence of racism and white supremacy in library management and operations? So if you want to tackle those 2 questions, I'll be grateful.
Okay, I don't know if I can do the second one. I think that's for all of us, but no, there really hasn't been. The problem with some acquisitions from many regions of the world is that digital resources, ebooks, just don't exist. In Latin America, 93% of the books that are published are in print. The other 7% is evenly divided between audiobooks and ebooks. They're just not out there. And that's one of the reasons why Salam wrote that resolution on collection development in the time of COVID-19 and the other resolutions that Mary was talking about, to bring awareness, particularly to our administrations and collection development managers, that books in many regions of the world are not electronic. So unfortunately, no. There are, as far as open access is concerned, there aren't any from Brazil that I know of. I mean, there's a couple of open access monographic databases, but they don't have a real large impact, particularly on academic titles, I think, and they tend to be older. We do have some wonderful open access databases for journal articles, such as Scielo and Redalyc. There's a whole bunch of them. Certainly Latin America was way ahead in open access databases. But yeah, unfortunately, there's nothing that we can do. I would mention though that Lane did undertake a web archiving project on Brazil, looking at websites that were, I think they were government based, and some NGOs kind of looking at the changes that were happening during the Bolsonaro government, and that complemented the Brazilian Borrow Direct project, I think, very well.
Thank you, Jana. And the last question seems to be one of the, I believe, nuanced and complicated question to answer. So any one of you want to tackle it, I'll be grateful. I have no answer to that last question, right? Because I don't know how to answer it. Do you see the connection between the lack of expertise in the libraries in these languages and cultures and prevalence of racism and white supremacy in library management and operations, right? So language expertise is something very important to our work, but then relating it to the other aspect of librarianship, I don't know. And we're almost out of time. We are at 9:30. So Jana, would you like to say?
I think I would just say to that I think it's more a lack of understanding of other business models other than the US and European business models. You know, they're just, our collection managers just don't understand it. And it's our duty to educate them.
And I believe that there's one more question. Okay, Adan Griego from Stanford has mentioned that Latin America's publishing continues to be a print-based industry, just like you had said. So it's redundant information. Still, it's very important. Even smaller in areas like Bolivia, Paraguay, Peru, etc., etc. So I have one last question. Oftentimes in the library world, we are told that you come from the world where you use squiggly languages, right? Latin America is complicated, but most of the language scripts in Latin America are Latin-based. I may be totally wrong. I'm a Latin Americanist. So how do you deal with the question of squiggly languages in your daily working? And this question goes to Jeff and Mary, if you want to handle it. Thank you so much.
So the question refers to non-Romanized script. Is that, yes?
Yes.
Obviously, it creates certain challenges. But for instance, in Cormacia, we work with Burmese, Thai, Lao, Vietnamese, Indonesian, of course, is using a Romanized script. But perhaps I should back up a little. The question is referring to how we handle these scripts in terms of perhaps cataloging, or in which way?
Yes, because there was a question from Isabel Espinal about the lack of language expertise. So if you look at the Southeast Asia and South Asia, it's a tapestry of different languages with different scripts. Yeah. So one person to know all these becomes a complicated matter, in any library setting. So how do you allocate? Yeah, cataloging.
For Cormacia, I can say without any question, our greatest challenge is the decrease of catalogers, especially professional catalogers with the language expertise. We have seen a steady decline in those numbers. Every time we've lost people through retirements, those positions were never filled. And so we're having to do much more work in a very collaborative way with different institutions, and that's good, but it does not bode well for the future. And we have to recognize that without the catalogers, we cannot make materials in these languages available to patrons. And so ultimately the universities need to recognize that and step up.
Thank you so much for this answer. Mary, you would like to, just quickly, we don't have time. I know I've been told we're going over. So.
I think Isabel's question is really the point of what is a lot of this forum focus today, is to try to challenge us to think about the institutional structures that we have and how they support our work and where we're hindered in them. And I think most definitely there is some structural racism in our libraries and in our structures. And Jana referred to the commercial problem, and that's usually where I go, is to say, if Elsevier cared about Devanagari and Arabic script and everything like that, then it would be great. But that's kind of a cop-out at this point, to sort of say, why do our computationally based tools not support our languages? I think we should challenge that. Because there are millions and millions of people throughout the world who don't read English, and millions of people throughout the world who don't read in Roman script, and millions and millions of people around the world who don't read. So we need to think a little bit about all those folks, and I think that's the point of today's forum. And so I applaud Isabel for being brave and asking the question. I think it's a scary question to try to answer because it challenges a lot of our structures, but I think what we're trying to say, and I think Jeff said this very nicely, is as we have our aspirational goals that don't align with our infrastructure realities, we will continue to be challenged.
So thank you so much, Mary. Please join me in thanking all of the panelists for their wonderful presentations and thanking them for finding time out of their busy schedules, right? COVID does not mean that we are isolated and sitting home doing nothing. We are continuing our activities as librarians to help our users. So thank you so much. And we will, there are other interesting panels going on throughout the day. So look at the program and try to join us. And thank you, Patricia, Judy, for also facilitating this, this panel in coming into being an existence. So thank you again and have a wonderful day. Please take good care and see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.